took them under their wing and said, "You can be somebody." And Dr. Carson went on to become, probably in the minds of most, the greatest pediatric neurosurgeon in the world. His work is legendary, and yet today his message is to encourage us to make a difference. Just so you know, when Dr. Carson was scheduled to come, we did not know that God would have other plans. And in the process, we thought that he may not be able to come. And he said, "I want to come. But let me make it clear to you and to the press, this is not a political rally. This is not..." And he will tell you that is not why he's here. He's here because he wants to speak into your life and encourage every man in this place to leave this building to make a difference. Would you please welcome to this podium this morning my dear friend, Dr. Ben Carson.
Thank you for the wonderful invitation to be here. You know, America still is a place with great dreams. And, you know, my dream was medicine, to be a doctor. You know, I skipped right over policeman, fireman, and football player. I went straight to doctor. And I loved anything that had to do with medicine. I loved hearing the mission stories, church and Sabbath school about missionary doctors, and to me they seem like the most noble people on the face of the earth, traveling at great personal peril in many cases. I have a friend who's a missionary doctor. He called me a few months ago from Iraq, sort of shaken emotionally, because the village that he frequently went to, and ISIS had killed everybody. And he was devastated. But, you know, they face all kinds of dangers. And I decided when I was 8 years old that I would become a missionary doctor. And that was my dream until I was 13. At which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out and psychiatrist was in. Now, I didn't know what a psychiatrist, but on TV they seemed like rich people. Drove Jaguars, lived in mansions, had these big plush offices, and all they had to do is talk to crazy people all day. And it seemed like I was doing that anyway, so I said, this is going to work out extremely well. And, you know, I started reading Psychology Today. I was the local shrink in high school. Everybody brought me their problems. I would sit them down and stroke my chin, say, "Tell me about your mama." And then I majored in psychology in college. I had luminary professors like Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud. You know, I was gung-ho. And when I went off to medical school, I started meeting a bunch of psychiatrists. Need I say more? Just kidding. Some of my best friends are psychiatrists, but what I discovered very quickly is what psychiatrists do in real life and what they do on TV are two completely different things. And they're actually some of the more intellectual members of the medical family, but it really wasn't what I wanted to do. And I believe that God gives everybody special gifts and talents. So I just said, Lord, please help me to find the right thing. I started thinking about my gifts and talents, and I realized I had a lot of eye-hand coordination, the ability to think in 3 dimensions. I was a very careful person. I never knocked things over. I said, there's surgeon done that. And I love to dissect things, so I put all that together, and that's how I decided on neurosurgery. Some people thought that was a strange idea, because at that time there had only ever been 8 black neurosurgeons in the world. But you know, what I discovered, it doesn't matter what the numbers are if it's something that God wants you to do. That was really the key. I started out as an adult neurosurgeon, but I quickly discovered that no matter how good an operation you did on those chronic back pain patients, they never got any better until they got their stomach. Whereas with kids, you know, what you see is what you get. When they feel good, you know they feel good. When they feel bad, you know they feel bad. And you know, it's just such a wonderful thing. You can operate on a kid for 12, 15, 18 hours. And if you're successful, the reward may be 50, 60, 70 years of life. Whereas with an old geezer, you spend all that time operating, and they die in 5 years or something else. So, I'd like to get a big return on my investment. I'm just kidding, I like old people. I'm one of them. Anyway, but you know, what an amazing privilege it has been over the years to use the gift that God has provided to intervene in the lives of people in order to give them longevity and quality of life. It's one of the greatest privileges I think that anyone could ever have. And people ask me sometimes, don't you miss it? Because I retired in 2013. Well, you know, I still get to see a lot of my patients. I operated on nearly 15,000 people. So there's almost no place I go where there isn't one patient or a member of their family. So I get to follow up. A few months ago, I was in Kentucky. A young man and his family I saw, I had operated on him when he was an infant. And he had just graduated from college. #1 in his class after having a hemispherectomy, an operation where you take out half the brain. Can you imagine what he could have done with a whole brain? These things are pretty amazing, I must say. But before I go on, I should mention one thing. Everybody gives disclaimers these days. I'm in this corporate board, you know, this association, just so that you know. Well, I have to tell you, I am not politically correct. So it is possible. It is possible that I could say something that someone would take offense to. That would not be my intention by any stretch of the imagination. But you know how people are these days, you know? When I was a kid, they used to teach the kids the saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. They don't teach kids that anymore. Now, everybody walks around with this hypersensitivity. And I think we would be very smart to teach our young people not unanimity of speech and unanimity of thought, but rather how to respect someone with whom you disagree. Can you imagine the effect that that can have in our society? And, you know, for years I've had an ongoing battle with the PC police and how they try to intimidate people into silence. Why is that so important to me? Because there were a lot of people who fought, who bled, who died, so that we could have freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And there's no reason to do that. And it's really all about intimidation. And if you allow yourself to be intimidated, there's was almost no end to it. You know, I learned about intimidation as a youngster. I was intimidated by dogs. I was just really afraid of dogs. You know, I would be late to school because I'd be almost there and there'd be a dog. And I'd have to go all the way around the block and come back in another direction. And then there'd be another dog. And, you know, the teachers were getting tired of my excuses. And then there was this man, an elderly man, a friend of the family. And he said something to me that changed my life. He said, dogs will only bother you if you're afraid of them. If you ignore them, they won't bother you. I said, are you sure about this? Well, there was this dog on our block. Everybody was afraid. They didn't like to go down in that area. His name was Rusty. I said, you know what? I'm going to test this out on Rusty. So I go walking down there. Rusty could not believe his eyes. He started licking his chops. He kept running after me, barking and snarling. I said, this was a mistake. And he ran right up to my leg, sniffed it, turned around and went back to the porch. The next day, he just barked at me from the porch. The next day, he just looked at me. The next day, he didn't even look at me. It wasn't worth his while because I wasn't afraid. And that changed my life. And I think it can change all of our lives because there's no reason for us to be afraid, particularly when we align ourselves with the power of God. So, yeah. But there were problems along the way of realizing my dream of becoming a doctor. You know, my parents got divorced early on. My mother was one of 24 children. Got married when she was 13. She was shifted from home to home in rural Tennessee, trying to escape that horrible environment. And my father was much older. And they moved to Detroit. He was a factory worker. Some years later, she discovered that he was a bigamist in another family. She only had a third-grade education, but now, after the divorce, she was forced to fend for herself. We moved to Boston to live with her older sister and brother-in-law. Typical tenement, large multi-family dwelling, boarded up windows and doors, sirens, gangs, murders. Both of my older cousins who we adored were killed. I saw people lying on the street with bullet holes. But the thing that probably impressed me the most were the roaches. We had large, aggressive roaches. You know, in the more upscale areas, they call them water bugs, but we knew what they were. And then there were the rats. I mean, the water rats. The first time I saw one, I thought it was a dog. This thing was so big. And they jumped like 5 feet in the air. It was horrifying. And while we were enjoying that environment, my mother was out working extremely hard. 2, sometimes 3 jobs at a time, leaving at 5 in the morning, getting back after midnight, scrubbing floors, cleaning toilets, because she didn't want to be on welfare. Her friends were saying, you got 2 boys, you can be on aid, and you don't have to do that. But she just didn't like the idea of being a victim. And she never felt sorry for herself, which was a good thing. The problem is she never felt sorry for us either. So there was never any excuse that we could give that was adequate. She always would say, do you have a brain? But the other wonderful thing was Uncle William. We lived with my Aunt Jean and Uncle William. And he tried to be a surrogate father for us. Trying to make sure that we had everything that we needed. He worked so hard at the meat packing factory and was such a kind-hearted man. And I've never seen anybody work as hard as he did, just hustling, doing anything to make a dime. And one of the most wonderful parts of my life was many, many years later, Uncle William always loved cars. And he really couldn't afford much more than a piece of junk. And I was able to give him the keys to a new Lincoln. He was just so happy. And the rest of his life, was just wonderful because of that. And it's wonderful to be able to do that. But, the interesting thing is that, we were desperately poor. We never had money for anything. But we had love. And that made the difference. And we knew that we were cared for. And interestingly enough, there are a lot of people who criticize me and they say, you grew up poor, you must have had a lot of government aid. And now you don't want people to have government aid, which is a bunch of crap. Where people get this sort of stuff from. But the fact of the matter is, what I do want to see is a situation where people are given a mechanism for climbing out of poverty so that they're not dependent in a society like ours. And one of the things that has really impressed me as I've traveled around the country is looking at people reaching out to people. There was one program where successful businessmen, and lots of them, each one adopted a boy from the inner city. Not officially, unofficially. Brought them into their world, showed them a different world, paid for their school in a private school. In a city where less than half of the kids graduated from high school, virtually all of these kids graduated, and most of them went on to college. That's what happens when people invest in other people. It has a lot to do with real success, the relationship. It's not just throwing money at something, but it's the relationships that we all develop with other people. And we have the capacity to do that. And particularly in the society in which we live today, in which there's so many broken homes, where so many young boys and girls don't have the opportunity to have the influence of a father, to have a father figure, somebody who takes an interest in them, can make all the difference in the world. Well, at any rate, the other key thing about my mother is she would never accept excuses. And if we made an excuse, out of her mouth came a poem called Yourself to Blame. We knew that was coming, so we wouldn't make an excuse. But when I think about people who were not excuse makers, I'm reminded of Ching and Ian Bunker, the original Siamese twins. Born in Siam in the year 1811, that's the term Siamese twins. Siam, of course, is Thailand now. They were joined in chess, something we call Thorcopegus or Xiphopegus. They were the ones who made Barnum Bailey famous, traveled all over the world. Everybody knew about the Siamese twins. And they left the circus, and they came to America, lived in the state of North Carolina, where they became farmers, successful farmers. Now, can you imagine being a successful farmer stuck to somebody's chest, staring them in the face 24/7, smelling their breath 24/7, not using that as an excuse? I mean, nowadays people hurt their little pinky and they won't work what's common for the rest of their lives. These guys were amazing. And not only were they successful farmers, but they got married to 2 different women. And between them, no pun intended, they had 21 children. So you can see they were fairly creative fellows too. But interestingly enough, their wives couldn't stand each other. So they had to live with one wife one week and another wife the next week. And they ran 2 successful farms, and they lived until they were 63 years old, which is much older than than most people did back in those days. What does that say about the ability to just suck it up and deal with it, whatever it is? That is really one of the real keys to success. Well, you know, my mother's dream was for us to be able to move back to Detroit. And, you know, interestingly enough, we were able to do that after a couple of years, still in a multi-family dwelling in a dilapidated part of the city with significant wildlife. But nevertheless, you know, she was independent. I was a 5th grade student. I was a horrible student. Worst student you could imagine. Everybody thought I was stupid, including me. And, but I used to admire the smart kids, even though some of them were pretty obnoxious. There was one guy, his name was Steve, who was the smartest kid in the class, who would always come up to you after a test with his paper in hand to show you his A and say, let me see yours, let me see yours. You wanted to let him see it all right, but you couldn't, you know. But, you know, the kind of student that I was reminds me of many students that I see today. More sadly, of many adults that I see today, who really haven't concentrated on informing themselves, of taking advantage of education. Do you know in this country today, 20% of people who enter high school don't finish? And that's in the information age, the technological age. And that's so important because education is the great divide in our country. It doesn't matter what your ethnic background is or your economic background. You get a good education, you write your own ticket. That is something that we must begin to emphasize again, because there are those who are telling a bunch of people that they are victims and that there's nothing that they can do, and it's not true. You can get a good education, you can develop that brain that God has provided, and you can determine for yourself which way you're going to go. The person who has the most to do with that is you. And we have to get our young people, particularly, to understand that the average person today lives to be about 80 years old. The first 20 to 25 years, you spend either preparing yourself or not preparing yourself. If you prepare yourself, you have 55 to 60 years to reap the benefits. If you don't prepare yourself, you have 55 to 60 years to suffer the consequences. And when you think about it that way, working hard early on is worthwhile and it pays big dividends. We can make sure that our young people fully understand that concept. We also need to understand that we live in a pretty terrific place in this country. You know, think about this. 100 years before America came along, 500 years, 1,000 years, 5,000 years, people did things the same way. Within 200 years of the advent of America, men were walking on the moon. It changed the course of mankind. It is a very exceptional country, and we need to do everything we can to make sure it stays an exceptional country. And we need to. In order to do that, we need to emphasize education. You know, I don't have anything against sports and entertainment. In fact, I enjoy them very much. But I do want people to understand that the thing that will allow America to remain a pinnacle nation is not the ability to shoot a 25-foot jump shot, it's the ability to solve a quadratic equation. And we have to begin to emphasize that in the right way. Don't have to exclude the sports and entertainment. But we need to recognize that as we look at pinnacle nations throughout the history of the world, they all fall after a sequence of things. They become enamored of sports and entertainment, lifestyles of the rich and famous. They lose their moral compass, they tolerate corruption, and they go right down the tubes. That is what happens, consistent pattern. And I believe that the United States can actually be different. We can actually learn from what has happened. Because see, we're different from all the other pinnacle nations in the sense that we are the child of every other nation. And we have the ability to learn from our parents if we're smart, if we use our intellect, if we don't have to inexorably go down the same course that all the others have gone down. And the education is such an important part of it. Being informed. You know, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson especially talked about an informed populace. They said our system is based upon an informed and educated populace. And if we ever become anything other than that, the nature of the country will rapidly change. Why? Because people would not have the knowledge to be able to assess what they were being told. And they could be easily manipulated and easily led. Very important concept. Well, you know, my mother was so concerned about my lack of academic performance, and she didn't know what to do, so she prayed. And she asked God to give her wisdom. And you know, that's the cool thing about God. You don't have to have a PhD to talk to him. You just have to have faith. And she had faith that he would give her the wisdom, and he did. At least in her opinion. My brother and I didn't think it was all that wise. I mean, turning out the TV, what kind of wisdom is that? Making us read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Libraries and submitting to her written book reports that she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. And she would put check marks and highlights. You know, we would think that she was reading them, she was. And I was not a happy camper, I gotta tell you. Everybody else was outside having a good time. I'm in the house reading books. But, you know, a lot of people say, well, why did you do it? Your mother was always out working. Back in those days, you had to do what your parents told you. There was no social psychology saying that the kid expressed themselves. You know, I started reading all kinds of things. I started knowing stuff that nobody else knew. It was fascinating. Within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class. And I remember after a test, you know, I went up to Steve. I said, Steve, how you doing the test? He said, oh, I got a 91. I said, well, gee, I got 100. I said, next time you need help, let me know. Man, sure felt good to say that turkey, but you know, I just had a different impression of who I was, a different outlook on life at that point. And it is so important to give people that positive outlook and to be thinking more about what they can do rather than what they can't do. It makes all the difference in the world. And that's why we have these incredible brains. We're made in the image of God. And God is no dummy. You know, we live in a society today where a lot of people think if you believe that God created you, you're some kind of an idiot. And, you know, I was having a public debate with a famous evolutionist in Hollywood. And he just thinks that you cannot be a scientist if you believe that God created the earth and that he created people. And at the end of the debate, I said, well, you win because you've convinced me yourself. You see, I believe that I came from God, and you believe you came from a monkey, and you convinced me you're right. You think about these wonderful brains that God gave us. Billions and billions of neurons. Hundreds of billions of interconnections. And to give you an example of how sophisticated your brain is, how many people here remember your birthday? Let me just see your hand. Okay, that's pretty good. It didn't take you long to respond to that. But what did your brain have to do? First of all, the sound waves that leave my lips travel through the air into your external auditory needs, travel out to your tympanic membrane, set up a vibratory force which goes across the ossicles in the middle ear to the over and round limb, set up a vibratory force in the end of the converting energy from mechanical energy to electrical energy, which travels across the cochlear nerve to the cochlear nucleus at the pontomedullary junction, from there to the superior olivary nucleus, descending bilaterally up the brainstem to the lateral meniscus to the inferior colliculus and the medial geniculate nuclei, across the thalamic radiations to the posterior temporal lobes to begin the auditory process, from there to the frontal lobes, coming down the back triculature, coming across and retrieving the memory from the medial hippocampal structure and the memory bodies back to the frontal lobes, the bed cell level, coming down the cortical spinal tract, across the internal capsule, into the cerebral pedal, descending down to the cervical medullary decussation, into the spinal cord brain area, descending there, going out to a neuromuscular junction, stimulating the nerve and muscle. So you can raise your hand. Woo! See if you can get one of those rap singers to do that. But that's a simplified version of what the brain had to do. I didn't get into all the coordinating and inhibitory forces who've been here all day talking about what your brain did in a split second. But if your brain can do all that and you barely have to think about it, what can your brain do if you concentrate on something? That's the kind of thing that we're going to have to start thinking about. Well, you know, I had things turned around academically. It was looking pretty good. But I still had a big problem. I had a horrible temper. I was one of those people who thought they had a lot of rights. The more rights you think you have, the more likely someone is to infringe upon you. And people were always infringing on my rights. I remember once a fellow hit me with a pebble. It didn't hurt, but I was incensed that he would dare hit me with a pebble. And I picked up a large rock, hurled it at his face, broke his glasses, almost put his eye out. Another time, a fellow was trying to close my locker. I didn't want to close it. I hit him in the forehead with my fist. Unfortunately, the lock was still in my hand. Put a 3-inch gash in his forehead. My mother was trying to get me to wear something. I picked up a hammer, went to hit her in the head with it. Fortunately, my brother caught it from behind. Other than that, I was a pretty good kid. But you can see how that temper could get you in a lot of trouble. When I was 14, another youngster angered me, and I had a large camping knife. I tried to stab him in the abdomen. Unfortunately, under his clothing, he had a large metal belt buckle on. Knife blade struck with such force that it broke and he fled in terror. But I was more horrified than he, as I recognized I was trying to kill somebody over nothing. And I locked myself in the bathroom. I started thinking about my life. And I realized that I would never realize my dream of becoming a physician with a temper like that. My options were jail, reform school, or the grave. And none of those appealed to me. And I fell on my knees and I just said, Lord, I can't control it. And my life is going to be wasted unless you can fix it. And there was a Bible, and I picked it up and opened it to the book of Proverbs. And there were all these verses in there about fools. It seemed like they were all written about me. But there were also verses about anger. Like Proverbs 19:19, there's no point getting an angry man out of trouble. He'll just get right back into it. And encouraging verses like Proverbs 16:32, mightier is the man who can conquer his temper than a man who can conquer his city. And chapter after chapter, verse after verse, for hours, I've stayed in there reading and contemplating and praying. And I came to an understanding that to lash out, to punch somebody, to kick down a door was not a sign of strength. It was a sign of weakness. It meant that you could be easily controlled. You could be easily manipulated. And if you were getting angry all the time, that it was a sign of selfishness. Because it's always about me, mine, I. Somebody messed with me. Somebody took my thing. They're in my space. Where does that come from? Selfishness. And if you learn how to step out of the center of the equation and you let it be about someone else, you virtually will not get angry. And you know, that day was the last day I had an angry outburst in my life. And you know, God it makes all the difference in the world, and it's empowering. And I decided on that day that God would not only be my heavenly Father, but my earthly Father as well. And you know, I got to tell you something. God is really cool, and He has a sense of humor. And I'll tell you why I say that. You know, from that day forward, I started reading every day in the morning and in the evening from the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs was written by Solomon. My middle name is Solomon. So God knew I was going to have this affinity for the book of Proverbs. Maybe my parents gave me that name. But interestingly enough, when Solomon became king of Israel, do you remember the first thing that happened that brought him great acclaim? 2 women came to him, claimed to be the mother of the same baby. What did he say? Divide the baby. Well, that's when I became well known, when I divided babies. So think about that. Think about that. He has a sense of humor. He's very, very cool. But, you know, you would have thought that all my problems were solved. I had things taken care of intellectually, and my temper was under control. But I had another big problem when I got into high school. I ran into the worst thing a young person can run into. It's called peers. P-E-E-R-S. That stands for people who encourage errors, rudeness, and stupidity. And that's just what they were doing. They're telling you what kind of clothes you needed to wear, who you need to be hanging out with. And I started listening to that stuff. And I went from an A student to a B student to a C student. My grades kept plummeting, and I didn't care because I was cool. High fives, low fives, pats on the back, doing the Detroit strut. You ever seen the Detroit strut? Sometimes when I'm walking, people say, "Are you limping?" I say, "No, that's the residual Detroit strut." But you know, in high school, even today, you still have the same thing. The cool guys and the nerds. And you can always tell, you know, the cool guys, they have the latest fashions, and, you know, they know all the tunes, all the movies, everything that's hip. And, you know, they have a car, 3 chicks on each arm. You know, they are just so cool. And then there's your standard grade A nerd. You know, he's got the high water pants and the thick glasses and the books, and none of the girls want to be seen talking to him in public. But you know, a funny thing happens. A few years go by, it's time to graduate from high school. The cool guy, he gets a job flipping hamburgers. The nerd has won a scholarship, goes off to college. A few more years go by. The cool guy, still flipping burgers, but he's cool. The nerd, graduating from college, signs a Fortune 500 contract, big signing bonus, first stop, goes off to the doctor, eye doctor, gets LASIK done. Next stop, goes to the tailor, gets some nice clothes. Next stop, automobile dealer, buys himself a nice Lexus. And now the young ladies are saying, "Don't I know you? Don't want to talk to the guy at McDonald's. You know, what am I talking about here?" Delayed gratification. Such an important concept to get across, particularly to our young people. Because pop culture tells you, you gotta have it, and you gotta have it now. But it's not true. The reason we have these sophisticated brains with these big frontal lobes, which allow us to engage in rational thought processing, is so that we can extract information from the past and the present and project it into the future as a plan, which means we can plan and strategize, as opposed to animals who just react. And there's so many people, and I'm sure you know some of them, who act like animals because they just react. They never seem to plan ahead. And we do have the capacity to do that. And it makes the difference between success and failure. Also, it gives us the ability to think out of the box. You know, I remember when I was in college, and I would come home in the summer to Detroit, looking for a job, and it would be hard to get a summer job. And people say, no, there are not going to be any jobs this summer, there'll probably be riots, and kids will be restless. But I would always find a job because I didn't do things like everybody else. Instead of looking at the want ads or the posters, I would just get on the bus, and I would travel until I saw a bunch of small businesses, and I'd get on and go knock on the door. Say, hello, my name is Ben Carson. I'm a student at Yale. I'm home for the summer, and I'm looking for a job. Guess what? They had a job. They didn't have an advertising budget, but if somebody showed up on their porch, they had a job for them. You know, do it a little differently. One summer, it was really difficult, and I remember when I was interviewing for Yale, I did a regional interview at a Young and Rubicon advertising firm. So I went to the Young and Rubicon building, got on the executive elevator, went up to the penthouse, waited for the secretary to turn her back, and went into the guy's office. And he said, Benjamin, how are you doing? How are things at Yale? I said, things are good, but I'm home for the summer, can't find a job. He said, did you try a personnel office? I said, they're not hiring any students. He picked up the phone, called the personnel director, said there's a young man by the name of Ben Carson on the way down there, give him a job. So I had a job that summer too. A little out of the box thinking, it worked very well. And then one summer I was working for the highway cleanup crew as a supervisor. Those people along the highway edges with the big garbage bags cleaning up everything. There was only one problem. They didn't want to work. Well, you know, as I was a supervisor, I didn't want to be paid if they didn't get their job done. So I got the guys together and said, look guys, you don't want to be picking up trash in the hot sun, right? They said, got that right. I said, okay, I have an idea. I said, why don't we start at 6 in the morning? I said, 6 in the morning? Are you crazy? What are they teaching you at that fancy school? I said, listen, at 6 in the morning is cool, and you can work efficiently. Your job is to pick up 100 bags of garbage, and you have 8 hours to do it. Here's the deal. You're working efficiently. If you can do it in 7 hours, I'll still pay you for 8. If you can do it in 6, I'll still pay you for 8. In fact, whatever amount of time you're able to do it in, I'll still pay you for 8. You have never seen people work like this before. I mean, by 8 a.m., they had 200 bags, whole stretch of the highway. The people who ran the program were flabbergasted. And they would say, Carson's crews are amazing, but we never see them. But, it worked. It worked. A little out of the box, but it worked extremely well. And, you know, that's the kind of thing that we have to be thinking about as a society in terms of how do we solve the multitudinous problems that affect us. And I think one of the real keys is looking back historically at who we are as a nation. You know, when there were communities dispersed across this land, in many cases separated by hundreds of miles from other communities, why were they able to thrive? Because people cared about each other. If a farmer at harvest time was out picking apples on a tree and fell on a tree and broke his leg, guess what? Everybody else harvested his crops. If he got killed, everybody else took care of his family. That is who we are as Americans. And we must continue to learn to reach out to our fellow man, because it is our responsibility to take care of our fellow man. It's nobody else's responsibility. And it will make all the difference in the world. Well, you know, I had a very rapid career. In no time I found myself chief of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. People would come from great distances, see Dr. Ben Carson, chief of pediatric neurosurgery, and I would walk in a room and they would say, when is Dr. Carson coming? Because they just had a different impression of what they would see. And I would say, well, I'm Dr. Carson. And some people just about have a seizure, which is how I got interested in seizure surgery. But no, that's not how it goes. But you know, no one ever walked out as I began to explain to them, you know, what we were trying to do. And there were just all kinds of fascinating cases. But one thing became so apparent to me early on. There were cases that I just simply could not explain. Incredibly complex things. People had given up on, and they would be successful. And I realized early on that it wasn't me. I used to think it was me. I thought I was this real hot shot. Came out of inner city Detroit, went to Yale, University of Michigan, became chief of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins at age 33. But the Lord made it very clear to me early on that it wasn't me, it was Him. And I just said, Lord, you be the neurosurgeon, I'll be the hands. And that's how the title Gifted Hands came up. It was a gift from God. And you know, when we recognize where the source of wisdom and strength is, it allows Him to use us. And the problem with most people, they experience a little bit of success and they get the big head. And they begin to believe that it's all of them. And then God can't really use them anymore at that point, and He has to move on. And we have to remember, you know, Proverbs 22:4 says, by humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. And He wants to do for us, but sometimes we get in the way. Our big egos and our big head get in the way. And He has to move on. And that's something so important to remember. And what is success? You know, 1997, I was asked to come to South Africa to head up a team in an attempt to separate type 2 vertical craniopicus twins. Twins joined at the top of the head facing in opposite directions. There have been 13 attempts to separate twins like that before, none of which have been successful. I knew it was going to be a great medical challenge, but it was also going to be a great social challenge because it was going to be done at the Medical University of South Africa at Medunsa, the only major life teaching hospital, always the stepchild throughout apartheid and in the post-apartheid period. This was going to be their chance to stand shoulder to shoulder with Cape Town, Johannesburg, all the other great universities. I wasn't ready for all that social pressure. I said, Lord, you're going to have to show me something here because smarter, more capable people than me have tried and failed. And as I studied their anatomy, I realized that the common drainage system that they had was narrower centrally than it was peripherally. The traditional neurosurgical literature said you should try to separate them over 3 or 4 operations with weeks to months in between so they could develop collateral circulation. But I felt that we could do it in one operation if we concentrated on where the vessels were narrowing down because there would be a proclivity for collaterals to form immediately as you interrupted those vessels. And I explained that to everybody and they said, you're the boss, we'll do whatever you want to do. It was 2 days before New Year's of '98, big sign over the operating room, God bless Joseph and Luca Banda. They were having song service and prayer service. I was thrilled. And I asked them to bring a stereo system in so we could play inspirational music. 19 hours into the operation, we were only 3/4 of the way finished. The part that remained was so complex, blood vessels were engorged, entangled, adhesed. It looked impossible. When we stopped and we went in a conference, I suggested that maybe we could cover the area over with skin, come back in a few months. They would have developed enough collaterals that we could then cut through. And the doctors from Zambia, where the twins were from in South Africa, said, it's a great idea, and I know it will work at Johns Hopkins, but we don't have the ability to keep partially separated twins alive. They'll die. I was devastated. I didn't have all my fancy equipment that I had at Hopkins. And I went back in there with the weight of the world on my shoulders. I had my surgical loops, a scalpel, and a prayer on my lips. I said, Lord, it's up to you. And I started cutting between those vessels that were so thin you could see the anesthetic bubbles coursing through, just daring to make a neck in me. Make a long story short, when I made the final cut that separated those 2 twins, over the stereo system came the Hallelujah chorus. And everybody had goosebumps. And when we finished the operation after 28 hours, one of the twins popped his eyes open, reached up to the endotracheal tube. By the time we got to the ICU, the other one did the same thing. Within 2 days, they were extubated. Within 3 days, they were eating. Within 2 weeks, they were crawling. And last month, they graduated from high school. But you know what? the success you had to be there to witness was the reaction of the people. This was done in their country, in their hospital. Their level of self-esteem was so high they were literally dancing in the streets. And you see, that's what real success is. It is using the talent that God has given you to elevate other people. Thank you. God bless.
Dr. Carson, thank you. Hearing you speak just makes me want to go to embrace it. You know, it's just so good, but thank you. One of the things that I love about Dr. Ben Carson is he wants to make a difference in somebody's life every time he can. Last night, you heard a young man named David Karika from Kenya talk about how in Kenya all the young students read about the life of Dr. Ben Carson. And that young man, who was reared in poverty, is now making a difference and even is in the United States currently helping Compassion International spread their story. There was a little boy with a dream that maybe someday he would get to be Dr. Ben Carson. When I asked Dr. Carson, could we do this, he said, absolutely. Let that young man's dream come true. They have not met before this moment. So David, Marissa from Kenya, would you come and meet Dr. Ben Carson?
I gotta tell you,